This is a 1973 orange OR-120, and it is one of the all-time classic British amplifiers. Oranges are revered in the Stoner Doom community, and they've been used by bands like Led Zeppelin, Fleetwood Mac, Boris, High on Fire, Sleep, Oasis, Weezer. So many great bands use these amplifiers, and today I'm going to tell you why. Today I'm in sunny Pensacola, Florida, and I'm going to be reviewing my personal orange OR-120. I'm going to go over its various quirks and features, then I'm going to give it a pulse score. We're going to go through the living room category as well as the stage category and give it a score that will help you know what this amp can do. Also, I'm going to give you a link to some great vintage orange OR-120s that are for sale right now on reverb.com, and for more of my thoughts, well, you can just keep watching this video. So the first thing I want to do is take you to the back of the amplifier. Now, this thankfully has a modern 3-prong cord, not the old 2-prong cords. I don't feel like getting electrocuted because there's no ground. This is really important to have when you own a vintage amplifier. The next thing we come to is, this is really interesting. On most amplifiers, when you see a knob back here, it's just a rotary knob. On my JTM 45, for example, it will change the ohms for the speaker output. As you can see, this one does too. But when I got the amplifier, I was surprised to learn this is not actually a knob, but it actually goes into one of these tube kind of sockets, and it completes a circuit. So if you want to be 240 volts, you actually pull it out and put it into 240 volts. If you want to be 115 volts, you pull it out and put it into 115. Very interesting. Next, we come to the slave output. So this is meant to go into an amplifier that is basically nothing more than a power amp. You might see sometimes on Reverb like vintage Mad Amp or Orange slave amps. Well, that's what this is meant to go out to. See, before the days of being able to plug your amplifier into the sound system at a venue that you're going to, you had to get all of your sound out to the front of the house with just your own rig. Well, nowadays you can plug in a 1-watt Marshall and be able to be heard from the moon. Next we come to the speaker jacks, and this does have 2 speaker outputs right here. And just a reminder, if you want to run 2 16-ohm cabs, you have to run it from the 8-ohm setting. So you always have to double the cabinets whenever you have it set to a certain ohm output. Next we come to this curious little thing right here, this seal of approval by the International Export Association. Now, I could only find a couple of references to it on the internet, chief among them being this one in the back of an old Popular Mechanics magazine. As far as I can tell, they don't really exist anymore, and I can't really tell that they ever existed apart from putting these on the back of orange amplifiers. Next we come to the serial number. Now, this is serial number 10,074. The serial numbers for OR-120s after the initial year of 1972, so 1973 and later, like this one, started with 10,000. And if it was between 10,000 and 11,000, that meant you had a 1973. And according to this serial number, this was the 75th one ever built. The 1972 models were what was known as picks only, which I'll get into in a few minutes. And you'll also see that it is indeed an OR-120. There were 2 of the OR series at the time. There was the OR-80 and the OR-120. The only difference between an OR-120 and an OR-80 is that the OR-80 has 2 fewer power tubes. That is it. Now, there were other models. There was, for example, the GRO series, the GRO 100 and the GRO 50. From what I've been able to gather, those actually were still built by Mad Amp and were cleaner sounding than these OR series, the GROs taking on more of a GT 120 kind of flavor. Now we're in the back of the amplifier. You can see it runs off of 4 EL34s for the power section. It has 2 12AX7 tubes for the preamp section. But take a look at these vintage Parmico transformers. They are absolutely massive, and they make this thing weigh a ton, but they contribute to that big, massive punch that these amplifiers have. And you can see that there are some replaced parts, 2 new JJ capacitors. It should have the capacitors replaced. If you find an amplifier that is touting itself as being all original and still has its original capacitors, they're probably going to have to be replaced. You'll also notice back here that you can see these handles come all the way through from the front through into the back and hold the chassis really nice and rigid. Really cool thing that Orange and Mad Amp did. Back around to the front of the amplifier and out of the sun so my GoPro stops overheating and, well, I stop overheating too, I'm going to go over a lot of the features here on the front of the amplifier, obviously, but the first one I want to talk about is this crest, the voice of the world crest that Orange is known for. Cliff Cooper, the founder of Orange, did a really interesting interview with Reverb.com recently. I'm going to link to that article in the notes below. He talked about the development of this crest. He likes crests, he thinks that they are something that indicates class, and he wanted to have one for his Orange amplifier business. The sun and the moon mean they work day and night. The scales represent justice, that they are fair. The orange tree represents Orange symbolically holding on to the world. The music symbols stand for volume increasing or decreasing. The lion represents strength, and the hammer and chisel stand for craftsmanship. And the coolest part is a little bit of Cooper's self-insertion, for the barrel up here represents his name. A Cooper is someone who builds barrels. Kind of neat. Next we'll get to the things that actually make noise. Over here we have the low and high inputs, the only difference really being a resistor to keep the low from being as bright and aggressive as the high input. Next I'm actually going to come to the tone stack. I'll get back to the FAC in just a moment. The tone stack, curiously, only has low and high. There is no middle. There is an FMV tone stack, which is what people refer to as being Fender Marshall Vox, that does high, middle, and low, but this is a Bandexol tone stack. It only affects the low and the high frequencies. In a traditional FMV tone stack, whenever you turn one knob, it's going to really affect the other frequencies as well. You can turn up and down the highs, and it's going to affect the lows as well. This is completely independent. Whenever I move the lows around, it will not affect the highs. Whenever I move the highs around, it will not affect the lows. And as you probably guessed, with both knobs at noon, it is going to be a flat EQ. Whenever I turn it down, you're going to have a lot more mids present. Whenever I turn it up, the mids are going to be much less noticeable. So you really do have, in essence, a 3-band EQ. It's just that it affects the mids by getting rid of or adding in other frequencies. Now back to the FAC knob, this stands for Frequency Analysis Control. On MADAMP, they say that it stood for Frequency Attenuation Circuit. Not sure who to believe here, maybe Orange for oranges and MADAMP for the old Orange MADAMPs. But regardless, what this does, it's very similar to the depth knob that you'd find on a MADAMP GT120. With the knob all the way to the left, this is accentuating the low frequencies. When you turn it to the right, it's going to get brighter. So this also affects the gain as well, and you'll hear it really interact with these controls when I plug the amp in later. Next we come over to the HF drive, or the high frequency drive. This affects high frequencies, but different ones from the actual tone knob over here. This one will affect much higher frequencies than this knob ever will. So you can kind of see all of these in a line here, affecting from the very lowest frequencies to the very highest frequencies. So it's a really interactive, big, almost 4-band EQ. Next we come over to the gain control, or what's actually the volume control, since this is a non-master volume amplifier. There is no preamp gain control that I can change on this, so the reason that this is marked gain, I believe, is that at this time Orange was trying to make an amplifier that was higher gain to compete with Marshalls and the like. People had complained that the Orange MADAMPs were too clean sounding. In fact, Tony Iommi apparently complained about this when he played Beat Club with Black Sabbath. So, in an attempt to try to market themselves out of a hole, Orange added in this gain knob instead of a volume knob. I think it's a really interesting idea. Next we come to the echo, send, and return. Now this may look like an effects loop, and in fact I talked about the effects loop that was on the front of my MADAMP back when I did the MADAMP video. Well, this is not an effects loop. It kind of is. You see, at the time, Orange was making a specific reverb unit that was meant to plug into these heads, and it really only worked with that. This is a passive loop. It's not very good with anything that has any sort of dry signal in it. It may work okay if you use something that has a pure 100% wet signal, but other than that, it's really not going to sound very good. Next we come to the power switch, and as you can see, there is no standby switch. So like my MADAMP, what you have to do is turn the volume all the way down, turn it on, wait about 30 seconds to a minute, then turn your volume to your desired level. Next, I want to mention these really cool grab handles. When we had the amplifier turned around the other way, I mentioned that they had these handles on here, and they really make it a lot easier to get it off of really high amplifier cabinets. I really love that these things are on here. They're robust, they're sturdy, and they're really practical. Next, I want to go over the graphics. I mentioned earlier that in 1972, they introduced the graphics-only orange. Well, the reason that they did that was because these amplifiers have to go to a lot of different countries, and not everybody speaks English, so they wanted people to know what they did. And even when they went away from them being graphics only, they still kept them there as a legacy thing. Going from left to right, you have an instrument cable going into a jack for the picture above the inputs. You have this cool sine wave kind of thing over the FAC control. Over the EQ, you have the bass and treble clef with arrows pointing down and up. On the HF drive, I guess it's just a fist showing you that you have control or power over those frequencies. Then over here on the gain, you have a speaker showing those sound lines coming out of it. And on the echo, this is my favorite, it shows this arrow going and bouncing off of these mountains like this might be the official amplifier of Ricola. And finally, and quite fittingly, there is this lightning bolt over the power switch. What's interesting about this lightning bolt is this is really similar to the one that's used by electric amps as their logo today. Finally, coming to the bottom of the amplifier, we get to a feature that I wish a lot more amplifier companies would do. I love these plywood skid plates that are on the bottom here. You can put this on any width cabinet you want. It'll never have feet that are hanging off of the edge. It's always right for every single width. Electric Amp still does this. I wish that Orange still did this. I wish that everybody offered this as an option at least. So those are all the quirks and features of the 1973 Orange OR-120. Now it's time to get it into the studio and give it a Paul score. Okay, so playing the Orange OR-120. I'm going straight into the cabinet right now. This is an old GE radio that stopped working and I converted into a speaker cabinet. It has a Weber Thames on the top, a 100-watt version of the Weber Thames, which is a copy of the old high-watt Fane speakers. On the bottom is an EVM 12L. The microphone I'm using is a Sennheiser MD421, set about 3 inches away from the cloth, and I'm close to the center of the speaker, being the Weber Thames. The amp is set fairly clean right now. I'm going to the high input right now. The FAC is second from the highest setting. I like this amp set fairly bright. The low is set just above noon. The high is set at 3 o'clock. HF drive is just above noon, about 1 o'clock, and the gain is set really low. It might be on 1 or 2. The guitar I'm going through right now is my old Greco EG600. This has a DiMarzio Super Distortion in the bridge. It is obviously the Ace Frehley model. PAF Pro in the neck. Really great guitar, better than the Norlin era Gibsons of the time. This is actually a 2-piece body and a 1-piece neck, and an ebony fingerboard too. And this is the amp set fairly clean on the bridge position. That's nice and punchy in the room. Let's turn the drive up just a little bit higher. I want to hear what this sounds like. Let's set it to about 9 o'clock. We should start hearing some breakup at this point. Okay, yeah, we definitely hear some. And you can hear it's really touch responsive too. That is starting to sound better and better the higher I go. Let's turn the gain up even a little bit higher. Let's just let's bring the gain up to about 11 o'clock. Let's hear how this bad boy sounds. Really tight sounding. I'm really impressed with this. We are actually approaching heavy metal territory with this thing. Let's hear, I'm actually going to dial the highs back just a hair. I want to keep this punchiness and this clarity, but I really like how this is sounding. Let's go up to gain being about 2 o'clock. Now we're entering real metal territory. Let's just try some thrash galloping. All right, I'm suitably impressed with how this is sounding. You don't think you're going to get that much gain out of an amplifier from 1974. I want to turn up the EQ controls a little bit higher. Bring up the HF, bring up the treble and the bass. I'm going to bring the gain up even more. I want to see just how saturated I can get this. I was getting some feedback earlier. I'm going to see, and I'm obviously pretty close to the speakers right now. But let's just see exactly what kind of gain we can get. Let's hear how it cleans up. That is incredible how clean that gets. Let's try another guitar. All right, so I've grabbed my Stratocaster. You might remember this from the Mad Amp video that I did a while back. Just American Standard pickups, Alder classic Strat body that the paint has worn off on, or flaked off on actually. Kahler vibrato with the Teflon glass rollers and an aftermarket, very thinly finished maple neck. It's so shimmery and alive. I don't even really need to run effects through it. You know, it's interesting. This kind of takes you back to the beginning of rock and roll where there were no effects. There wasn't anything you really could do to your guitar, it was just, you're going straight into the amplifier for the most part, and you're relying on the tone of that amp to do all that you want it to do. All of the tonescapes that you want to create come from your interaction with the controls on your guitar and the controls on the amplifier, and largely the controls on the guitar, because you'd set this and forget it. Okay, so now on the 4th position, neck and middle. Getting some Dire Straits kind of, what was that, not Southbound Again, whatever the first song on the first Dire Straits album was. This is the neck pickup. Let's really drive this out. Let's bring the gain up. I'm gonna bring the gain up to noon because this guitar can be pretty sharp. I'm gonna leave the EQ where I am, although I'm gonna bring up some of those really high highs, just a little bit in the HF drive, leaving the FAC on the 3rd position. Not gonna get a lot of dime bag out of this. Reduce the FAC a little bit. I'm going to boost those highs again, and I'm going to lower the HF drive again just a little bit, but let's turn the gain up a little bit higher. Let's just see how much rock we can get out of this Stratocaster. Go back to the bridge pickup. Yeah, you see why people like these. Let's plug in another guitar. Okay, now we are in C standard, my old SG2 that has a, oh gosh, what is this? The pigtail kind of Leo Kwan bridges with titanium posts to hold it down flush to the top of the guitar, as flush as it can possibly be held anyway. And these are Mike Rylander copies of the old John Birch Magnums from the 70s. Let's hear how this bad boy sounds. Clean. So it's still a little overdriven. I mean, they're 24K pickups, you're going to have to expect that, but still decently clean. And I want to hear this thing distort, so I'm going to set it up a little bit above 9 o'clock. We're starting to get that really nice feedback. Now, this is the funny thing about old Doom, Black Sabbath, is that there's actually more clarity there than you'd think. You think all those guys are just turning their amps up to 10 on everything, and that's what their sound was. And actually, there's a lot more clarity and punch to it than you'd think, especially for recording purposes. You don't want to have it be this big, massive mush, unless you're asleep, I guess. Although those Mad amps that they played through on Dope Smoker were pretty darn punchy. And if you watch the Mad Amp video that I did, you will hear that even maxed out, it's still got a lot of clarity and punch to it. Let's turn the distortion up even more, because I do want to get some nice doomy riffs here. Whew! I am just shy of noon. I'm actually going to aim the guitar away here a little bit so I don't get as much of that feedback. That's cool. That is really cool. Let's do a more familiar riff. So that is the Orange OR-120. I hope you've enjoyed this demonstration. There will be more demonstrations coming of other amplifiers in the future. I need to go over my PRS HG70, for example. But for now, let's just go on and give this thing a Paul score. We're going to start with the living room score, where I'm going to judge how it does as a fun amp to jam out in your living room or bedroom. Starting in the styling category, this amp is an all-time classic. With its bright orange Tolex, white faceplate with silver grab handles, unique graphics, iconic logo and crest, and big beefy knobs. I do give the edge to the Pix-only 1972 model, since that's the one that everyone automatically thinks of when they think of orange amps. But there aren't many amps more memorable or fun-looking. If you have one of these in your home or studio, it will get fawned over, and it gets a 9 out of 10. For the tone category, it's just not an amp that's at home in the living room. With no master volume, it has to be insanely loud before you'll get that famous orange distortion. You can use an attenuator, but it will never be a tiny terror or micro terror. However, if you don't mind playing clean and at low volume, this thing sounds great even with the gain knob at 1. And if you don't have neighbors and you can occasionally turn the volume higher, you will be rewarded with rich tube saturation, and it earns a 7 out of 10. As for the reliability category, reliability is always a question mark with an older amp. There are always caps to be replaced, transformers to be looked after, and of course general wear and tear. Vintage oranges especially are known for needing lots of attention and eating power tubes. Also, it's important to remember that these were made to run on 110 voltage, so to protect the amp you should use a variac like I do to reduce the voltage and keep from damaging it with your 120 wall outlets. Still, it's a hardy handmade amplifier with a rugged chassis and high quality parts. There are plenty of techs who know these amps inside and out. Replacement parts are readily available, so it gets a 6 out of 10. The fun factor is next, and this amp is a blast to play, but it's not thrilled to accept your pedals in the front of it, and the echo loop is nearly useless. The fun comes from the inherent tone of the amp, and since we're still in the living room category and the tone is kind of reliant on the volume, it gets a 7 out of 10. As for the cool factor category, this one's a no-brainer. There aren't many amps that could be considered cooler than this one, with its gorgeous tone, eye-catching appearance, and huge roster of artists from every genre who use oranges, and it gets a 10 out of 10, giving this amp a living room score of 39 out of 50.
As for the stage score, we will begin with the features category. This amp has, in my opinion, unrivaled control over the tone with the best tone stack in any amp I've ever played, but a lack of proper effects loop and no master volume definitely hurt it in this category, and even the presence of a slave out, multiple speaker outputs with adjustable resistance, and the ability to switch voltages for American and European plugs can't overcome the lack of modern features, and it gets a 5 out of 10. But the volume category is where this amp really shines. It is brutally loud, hanging with amps that have much higher power ratings, and easily earns a 10 out of 10. In the practicality category, it is designed to sit on top of any cab, and the grab handles make it a cinch to move around, even onto tall speaker cabinets. It uses 4 EL34s and 2 12AX7s, so there's no hunting down strange tubes when it's time to change them out. But these amps can be finicky about the brand of tube and really sound best using expensive vintage Mullards. Plus, as I mentioned before, it's not the best pedal platform, so it earns a 6 out of 10. The quality category looks at fit and finish and materials, and this is another area where this amp excels. The pots are the highest quality and all turn cleanly and smoothly, which is no mean feat 45 years after it left the factory. The jacks are hardy and hold cables solidly. The shell and chassis could handle getting run over by a tank. It really was built to last forever and is up there with the finest of boutique amplifiers and gets a 10 out of 10. The value category is another area where this amp is strong. These don't tend to go down in value as long as they're maintained properly, and they sell for usually a couple $100 less than the Marshalls of the same period, so they are a good value for a vintage amplifier that gets you an amazing boutique sound, so it earns a 9 out of 10 for a total stage score of 40 out of 50, giving it an overall score of 79 out of 100. The OR-120 is a fantastic amplifier, and if you're in the market for a vintage amp that will peel the paint off walls and make a bold statement everywhere you perform, there's none better.